Thank you, David. Well, that was quite an intro. So first off, I want to thank David and everybody from ThoughtWorks who has helped sponsor it, and other sponsors. I mean, I think let's give a round of applause for them. Having organized several conferences, including ones that my company backed, and knowing the trade challenges of getting everybody here and getting the venue and doing all that stuff. Conferences are a lot of work, so definitely be kind to all the people that helped make this possible. And I'm really excited to be here. So David, the way I ended up coming here is we put on an event in Portland a couple of months, well, I guess now it's about 5 or 6 months back. Itamar, myself, Troy Howard, a few others put on an event called .NET Fringe, which was all about .NET open source. And then like David reached out through a friend like right after the event, and he's like really excited about this. We want to do one in in Texas, in Dallas. And we're like, can we take a breath? Like, we just, not Itamar, he was ready to go. He was ready to go as soon as the doors closed on Fringe, V1. But anyway, and then David was like, we were just not in a position to really invest the kind of time that we wanted to make this like another Fringe. But I know that Itamar and Adam and a bunch of other people put their effort in. So anyway, moving on. Thank you guys very much for making this possible. And it's great to see what is happening in the .NET world around open source. This talk is not going to be about .NET. So let's just set the context right here. I want you guys to elevate. I want you to lift your mind. And I want you to think about open source and the larger open source community that you are part of. You're not a .NET open source developer. You're an open source developer. And open source actually is changing the world. And I'm going to show you some of the things that are happening. And I'm going to go beyond just the cool libraries and other stuff that we're all working on day to day. So just to give a quick thing of who I am, I've been doing open source in the .NET world for about 10 years. I used to be at Microsoft, and at that time, I was with a bunch of people that were really trying to push on how to get Microsoft to be more open, how to embrace more open source kinds of things. And so that was a real personal mission for me early on, and then lots of amazing things started to happen at Microsoft and really opened up. But people like Scott Guthrie were there from the very beginning. I mean, 10 years ago when I was at Microsoft pushing on open source all the way at the top, Scott was like, he wasn't as high as he is now, but he was pretty high up. He was the general manager of the .NET framework, and he was like, yeah, this is good. We need to do this. And I've also been a big supporter of the open source community. I've put on a bunch of open source events. One was actually in China, an event called Who.js, which was the first JavaScript open source event in China. A big node.js advocate as well, but certainly .NET has a place in my heart because I've been developing with it for like 12, 13 years. Actually 15, the betas, yeah, so probably closer to 15. My day job, I work at Splunk. Splunk is not an open source product. We have lots of open source libraries. I work on a lot of open source libraries at Splunk. And I'm going to be talking a lot about open source, but I work on a paid product. I am not against paid products. I think open source is really, really valuable and awesome and doing amazing things, but nobody walk away from here saying, oh, well, he works on a paid product. How can he be talking about open source? The two are not mutually exclusive. And once upon a time, I built a bunch of frameworks at Microsoft. Some of them you might have used, like this one called ASP.NET Web API. So anyway, that's enough. Let's move on. So as I said, I want you to expand your mind. Open source really is changing the world, and you are part of this larger community. And I want you guys to digest that here. You know, we're talking about .NET Unboxed, which is taking .NET out of the box, but it's also taking us out of the box. There is a whole world out there that's doing some amazing things, and you guys are now part of it. But you need to kind of take the reins and run with it, and that's a theme that's going to be prevailing in this talk. So let's talk about changing the world, but actually, sorry, don't want to do that yet. I just jumped forward on one thing that I didn't mean to. But before we do that, you know, we've been making these trips back in time. So this was actually my first computer. And out of respect for my friend Adam Ralph, I also reached into my brain to think about the kind of programs I used to write on my VIC-20. Some of you might have seen the VIC-20 before, and the screen actually really looked like this. I had a black and white monitor. I was 8 years old when I was doing this, and I actually remembered the first kind of programs that I wrote. So I'm actually going to write one for you right now. It's really small. It's really stupid. So, and the wacky thing with this is an emulator, obviously, is that the keys map directly with the ASCII characters and what they were equivalent to in the VIC-20. So you might see me type something weird, like Shift-2 is quote, which it's not on my Mac keyboard. So it's a little bit fun. So we'll say, hello, Unboxed. And I'll put yeah, there I go. I'll put a quote. And then, like I said, I really used to do this kind of stuff. I'll say for I equals 1, 2, 200. And I'm going to say print message string, and then I'm going to do a tab. This is going much better now than it was when I was practicing it. Oops. Okay. And then I'm going to do a 30 next. So this is a program. What will it do? Oh! What was that? Oh, so 10 is wrong. Thank you. See, I told you. I knew I was going to fumble here, but I thought it'd be cool, so that's why I went ahead and did this anyway. So let's add exclamation points now. And then we'll go here. There we go, yay! But I literally, like, this was really like the first programs I ever wrote. As soon as I knew how to print, that was it. So, and that was VIC-20's basic for those of you that have never seen it before. Okay. There we go. So that was actually what the moving on slide was supposed to go to. So let's talk about changing the world. So first thing I'm going to talk about is something that's going to be very dear and near to all of us, which is developer stacks. And it turns out that there are a lot of new open source stacks that have popped up within the last 5 years. And what's significant about these, they're all being built right out in the open. Most of them are being built on GitHub. And they are evolving. The community is evolving all of these stacks. Now, there have been other stacks like Rails that was around. It's not the first time. But there certainly is an explosion that is happening now. Node was one of the first ones, I think, that was super disruptive about 6, 7 years ago. It came and hit the world by storm, and it was all done in this very organic way on GitHub. How many people here have not heard of Node.js? Well, times have absolutely changed, because I used to go into rooms, and I'd be like the only Microsoft guy with a Mac, and I'd be talking to folks and saying, what is Node? And who here has heard of Node? And no hands would go up. So a lot has progressed. There's been a lot of innovation on top of the JVM, like Scala. That is all open source. You can go out there, you see the language, you want to change something, send it a pull request. Golang. And Go has been really interesting as a language because of the fact that it runs cross-platform and it does not require a runtime. And anybody who's dealt with any of these other stacks, including the ones we work with, like .NET, has dealt with the pains of cross-platform compatibility, making sure the right dependencies are there. Go has really nailed that, so it's quite interesting. And then, of course, we have F#. F# is awesome, completely open source. Now, I like the next one, which is the OpenJDK, right? So Java got acquired by Oracle. A lot of people in the community were pissed off about that, and they're like, what does this mean to the future of Java? And there are some major companies. I mean, Java came back. For a while, it was kind of like dead, just boring enterprise stuff. And then a whole bunch of innovation started to happen on top of the JVM. But now there is an OpenJDK. You can send a pull request to the Java, the JDK, their runtime and their libraries, which is pretty significant. And of course, we have the work that's gone on with .NET. Now, .NET's not new, just like Java. It's been around a while, but there's a brand new stack. That's different than the OpenJDK, which is basically like an existing stack that just got opened up. Whereas in the case of .NET, we all know what's happening. It's all happening on GitHub, pretty exciting stuff. And then I wanted to mention Rust Lang, which Rust, many people here may not have heard of. It's kind of like for doing really highly performant programming, like the kind of things you would do C++ with. It's a very new language. Also, growing up on GitHub, growing up in open source. This directly impacts all of us. That's what we do. That's our jobs. It's now all happening in a very significant way, and major companies are investing in all of these stacks that you're seeing here. So another big shift has been around this big data thing. Big data has just been crazy. There's been a ton of innovation. All these companies are spending millions or hundreds of millions of dollars investing in this thing called big data. We're not going to talk about what big data is. It's awesome. Just know that. But there's a lot of innovation that is all happening in open source around big data, and it has driven the momentum of big data. One of the biggest ones was Hadoop. And Hadoop is, a Java technology, MapReduce pattern, basically for big data. It's a big data server. It's being deployed massive scale. This is community driven. This is open source. This is awesome. And this is, not just the libraries that you and I share. These are full servers that whole companies, lots of really, really big guys are betting on. Cassandra is another one. I mean, how many people here have not heard of Cassandra? Cassandra is a database that is being used at massive scale. Companies like Facebook, Twitter, etc. are using Cassandra, also fully open source. Kafka is one that you're hearing a lot about now. Kafka is a really efficient way to be able to send massive amounts of data in that can then run through a pipeline of processing, also open source. Now, a lot of this stuff is actually all JVM based. It's not to say that the only innovation that is happening in big data is around the Java world, but honestly, a lot of it is. It just so happens. And that's why when Microsoft went and invested with Azure in the whole big data space, there was a choice. What do we do? It's we need to embrace Hadoop. There is a huge ecosystem around Hadoop. We need to make it possible. And then, of course, we have Flume and Elasticsearch. Itamar might have a couple of thoughts about Elasticsearch. Another really popular product that developers love. It's easy to get, and it is a suite of capabilities for building big data type solutions. And you can go out there and send a pull request. So this is, a great example of where this was a new trend. This is like a big change in the industry that big data has come along. And this is a theme that I want you to keep track of as we go further, is what has happened. And this is where I think open source is so significant. The major shifts that are happening in the industry now, open source is very tightly attached to it. And that was not necessarily the case before. And part of that was because lots of big companies that tend to be part of these big shifts were not really in a state where they were ready to use open source. And that has changed. Okay, moving on. This one is actually pretty significant. Configuration and deployment. This is also something that has very recently, it's not new. Configuration and deployment is not new. But what is new is the level of scale at which we're deploying applications now. And the types of environments and the speed, time to market, so critical, continuous delivery. It's caused the need for all these new tools to appear. Some of them you may not know. Some of them may not be as well known actually in the Microsoft ecosystem, but I'm going to tell you about them now. So this is a list. Docker, you've probably heard Microsoft talking a lot about. So Docker is basically a way to spin up virtualized containers that can run applications, and they spin up really, really fast. We've had the ability today to do virtual machines. Docker takes it to a whole new level. Now, how many people here have ever actually used or even seen Docker, actually worked with it or seen it? Okay, a few of you. I'm going to take you guys through your very first Docker demo for those that haven't. It's going to be very small. So when you install Docker, they have this quick start terminal. If you install the Docker toolbox, so you can see I'm in Docker right now. And Docker has this concept of images. So you can create images, and images can layer on top of each other. And the images are the things that are actually going to be hosted in these containers. And the real beauty of Docker is, one, those images are portable. They can move around to different machines completely transparently, just like the reason for the name of Docker is not an accident. Just like I could take a big cart, load a bunch of stuff, one of those big crates, load a bunch of stuff in it, and I can easily move it around, say, on the dock. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to just run the hello world image. Let's see. So I already had the image installed on my machine. It would have pulled it down if it had not been pulled down. And this just did a hello world. Now what actually happened there? It spun up a container which was essentially like a new virtual machine and executed the code in it, which in this case the code was just a simple thing that was just dumping a bunch of stuff to standard out. And then the container went away and died. So you can create them and destroy them instantly, something you cannot do with virtual machines. Generally, what the Docker model is, these will be hosted within virtual machines. This is like one of the most significant things that have happened, honestly, in the last couple of years. I'm amazed at how fast Docker adoption has risen. And organizations across the globe are now really looking, the largest organizations, looking to use Docker as a way to kind of manage their deployments. And of course, Microsoft has gotten on board with it. So, so one of the things I could also do sorry, that's wrong. So I just did docker run it ubuntu bash. That's spun up a new container and put me in a Linux container. Now I'm running on Mac, so I'm actually using Docker Machine, and it's running VirtualBox because Docker today doesn't work on the Mac because the isolation that Docker offers, very low level, is not available within the Mac today. So you have to run within a virtual machine. If I was running on a pure Linux box, I wouldn't have to do this. But look at how fast that was. I now have a machine. For all intents and purposes, to me and my application, it feels like I'm running on a dedicated machine. I'm not. And if I run multiple containers, they share resources. Pretty impressive stuff. All of these tools are open source tools. Docker is on GitHub. Docker is an open source tool. Community can contribute to Docker. As a matter of fact, my team just did that. We just contributed. If I go to the Docker repo, our product, Splunk, has the ability to ingest data at real time. And so you saw that output that I showed you when I ran that Docker hello world. Let's go to closed. Let's go to Splunk. So we literally just did a pull request against Docker, and that was accepted in. And we're a third-party vendor, but we added support for our product into Docker. That wouldn't really be possible if they weren't open source. That would be a really complicated process. So this is an advantage of actually where open source is helping business. Helps our business because we see a lot of customers that are actually interested in using Docker. We're not putting any licensing restriction or anything in on that being in the code because it's just a mechanism to send that information to Splunk. Make sense? How many people here have heard of Ansible? Ansible is amazing. I mean, it just got acquired by Red Hat, $100 million. $100 million for this automated configuration tool. And of course, we have Chef and Puppet and a ton of others. One that might be lesser well known here is Zookeeper. People here have heard of Zookeeper? Right, so Zookeeper is a highly distributed configuration store. A lot of the other libraries I've talked about, especially in the Java world, like Hadoop and things like that, they all rest on using Zookeeper. Really robust, all open source. Find a problem, send a pull request. So now we're going to get more interesting. IoT, Internet of Things, the new buzzword. Also gaining traction really quickly. Also a great example of where open source is line by line in sync with this new trend and pushing this trend forward. So I wanted to show you how, as .NET developers, one really interesting thing is the Netduino board. And this is something that I know Scott Hanselman has been quite involved with as well. So this is a board that you can program, and you can use your .NET skills to do it. You don't have to learn something new. You don't have to learn some new language. And these boards can then be embedded in lots of different places. This is IoT. Very simple example. What do you guys think about that? Does that sound cool? That you can take your .NET skills and just bring them to a board? This one is really, really cool. This is called the Tehsil. So the Tehsil is a board that you program in JavaScript. So you use the same kind of JavaScript code that you would use to, say, write a Node application or use in the browser. You're now actually using that for an embedded device. And what's really nice about the Tehsil is you actually don't have to install an operating system or anything. It's all set up to go. You can just download your JavaScript with your Node modules to it, and it runs. And it's very, very cool stuff. There's also this new library called CyneJS. So this is a JavaScript client library for working with different types of devices. Look at all the platforms it supports. Again, everything you see here is open source. You want to create a new platform, you want to add support for it, you could do it. You want to add support, say, for like, you know, I don't know if it would work for the Netduino, maybe, because it's all .NET based. But you can add, you'll see support for Raspberry Pi, for Arduino. And you know, the thing too, when you think about IoT, there's different levels of devices that are out there. And this is something I learned a lot about actually at Splunk, because we've had a lot of customers that are interested in using really, really small devices. The devices you're seeing, like the Raspberry Pi and the Arduino and the Netduino, those are not really, really small. Really, really small are little sensors that are sending like thousands or even millions of counters of pieces of information continually. So there's a lot of devices that are really, really small that you won't see on this list, but there's a ton of devices that fit closer into the kind of consumer world that are really approachable to you as a developer. And lastly, the work that Windows 8 has done. Now, I'm not saying Windows 8 IoT is open source. No, it's not. But I do think it's pretty significant that Microsoft has created an operating system targeting the Raspberry Pi, which is something that a lot of open enthusiasts have loved and have used. So I wanted to call it out. Okay, moving on. So first off, let's just take a second to recap. So I think that's pretty cool. I mean, look at how far we've come and how much of an impact open source is having in all of these fundamental shifts that are happening that actually affect how we develop the kind of solutions that we build, and also open up new opportunities for businesses. But now we're going to shift a little bit. So we've spent a good amount of time close to home, the things that we're comfortable with and that we work with on a day-to-day basis. Now I want to up-level the conversation a little bit. So let's talk about healthcare and medical. So it turns out there's a lot of interesting open source things that are happening in the healthcare and medical industry. Oh, sorry. And so one of those, and this may sound boring, but it's really compelling, is OpenMRS. So this is an open source electronic medical record system. Now you may look at that and say, oh, well, why is that interesting? Well, every doctor's office around the world needs a medical record system. It's critical. And so what they're doing is they're coming together and they're building an open source one. That means even if you don't have the kind of budget to afford some of these other solutions that are really, really high end, there is an open source solution for you. That's open source really solving problems, and you could even say saving lives. I think that's pretty significant. And then there's also Open Clinical. So they're offering a lot of open source. So open source is not just about code, obviously. There's information. They're making a lot of information free to doctors, but they also have tools and open source tools that they're making available. So you can basically go to this site and you can get access to a wealth of free things that ultimately a lot of us probably build. And there are pull requests that are going on behind the scenes. But again, it is helping the industry, it is helping people, it is saving lives. Now this next one really touched me. So how is 3D printing changing the world? How is it helping people from a health perspective? So this is actually a project available for the MakerBot that is an artificial limb. And so these limbs would cost a huge amount of money if you had to buy them with your own, pay for them out of pocket. But now with 3D printers, you can actually print them. And so I have a video here. We'll see if you can hear it.
Walt Disney once said that animation can explain whatever the mind of man can conceive. He was talking about cartoons, but advances in technology have taken that basic concept to a whole new dimension. Michelle Miller shows us how the idea of a modern-day inventor became a 3D reality.
Grabbing a backpack is hardly the feat of a superhero, unless you're 12-year-old Leon McCarthy and your hand looks like it's straight out of a science fiction movie.
You've actually become sort of a
cyborg.
There's a cool fact.
Yeah, it's like a special,
I'm a cyborg.
Special instead of different.
Leon has been special since birth. While he was still in the womb, restricted blood flow prevented his hand from developing.
I saw his hand sticking up and there were no fingers on it. It was hard for my wife. It was hard for me.
2 years ago, his father, Paul, began the search for an inexpensive, functional prosthetic. What he found was this internet video posted by Ivan Owen, an inventor in Washington State.
I've always had this vision of people being able to build their own prosthetic device at home.
Owen and a collaborator in South Africa designed a hand that could be made by a three-dimensional printer.
So you can download this.
It's essentially like
that's the significance. You have a 3D printer, you can download this and print an artificial
plastic, and then layer by layer creates an object.
The design relies on wrist movement. Downward motion creates cable tension,
really making a
closes
difference
the fingers, while a move upward opens them.
And you can even imagine, I mean, maybe, who knows, maybe one day in the future you'll be able to print
so someone like Paul McCarthy in Marblehead, Massachusetts,
critical organs that you need to survive.
He took
artificial
the
heart,
idea
maybe.
to his son.
I thought
who knows? Who thought this would have been possible 5 years ago?
We can print all these fingers and then like clip them all in, and it was a little too much.
The first time you saw it and when you tried it out,
it was pretty awesome. Yeah.
There we go. That's a good way to stop. So I think we agree what he said was true. This is pretty awesome. How about 3D printed cars? This is actually becoming a reality now. So the automobile industry is now collaborating with enthusiasts. They're opening things up. It's going open source. Designs of cars are going open source. Software that the cars are using is going open source. This is pretty huge. This is not probably what a lot of us do day to day, but this is pretty significant. And so one really interesting company is this company called Local Motors. And so they have actually created a 3D printable car. And they're now, I think they're crowdsourcing now to do that again. I believe they've already created one. And they are doing a lot of really cool stuff, and it is all open source. This company, OS Vehicle, we'll watch another video here, they're really trying to change the face of the auto industry by open sourcing hybrid vehicles, hybrid vehicle designs.
What's next for mobility? Faster? Bigger? Luxury? You know, some of the traditional players think all of them. But we'd like to think that open source will bring not just vehicles, but the whole transportation industry to the next level.
Think about the significance of even using that term open source. This is a general video.
We designed
this
and built
not
an
for
open
developers.
platform made of a cutting-edge chassis, engine, and electronics that you can download for free to build your customized vehicle. Yes, it can be shipped in crates with lower environmental impact. And yes, it can be assembled locally in less than an hour, creating local jobs. But OS...
An hour. You can assemble the car in an hour. What do you think about that? And depends on who's doing the assembly. I could probably do it in 5 years. So there is even a platform of open source hardware for what's used within the vehicle. And that's what OpenXC is about. They're trying to standardize, but they're doing it in an open source fashion. You don't like the way this particular thing works in the car? Send a pull request. That's pretty cool. Now, one thing I really wanted to mention is the work that Elon Musk is doing with Tesla, because he did something quite significant. All of us probably want a Tesla. How many people here want a Tesla? They're coming down in price. It might be possible one day. And they've been doing really innovative things with power and all kinds of new innovations in how they're building their vehicles. And so, like most companies would do, that was all patented. Well, recently they lifted the veil on those patents. So this was a quote a little while back from Elon Musk. He says, "Yesterday there was a wall of Tesla patents in the lobby of our Palo Alto headquarters. That is no longer the case. They've been removed in the spirit of the open source movement for the advancement of electric vehicle technology." That is amazing. And he did this because he said initially they filed all those patents because what they wanted to do was make sure that their competitors, for example, couldn't get what they were doing. But he realized that the larger value was actually in using the work they've done to push the entire industry forward. And that the only way he could really do that was by opening things up. And so that is pretty awesome stuff. This one I love. Now, the video is pretty cool. How about space? What's happening with open source and space? There's actually a lot that is happening right now. NASA is on GitHub. And they've got hundreds and hundreds of projects that are now available that are open source. Everything you can think of. They're doing things like even telemetry of systems. I mean, they're sharing everything and making it widely available. And one of the reasons they're doing this is there's been this big movement now of amateurs and individuals that are trying to build their own rockets and get up into space. And NASA is saying, hey, if we don't need to basically have, we don't have to boycott, own this. Let's share this. Let's seed that. Let's all work together. And now the benefit there is more and more people have access to these libraries. They can use them. They can feed back. Everybody wins. And then there's SpaceX, which was a company created by Elon Musk, who, he's not just interested in making faster cars. He's also interested in more efficiently finding a way to get into space. How many people here have watched any of the videos around SpaceX? And it's almost sad. Like you see the rocket about to land and it looks great, and then it just explodes. And it's like, hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever gone down the drain. And then they try again, and then it explodes again. But they keep trying. It's progress. So in 2013, there was this Linux conference, and one of the guys from SpaceX spoke about how they're using all this Linux open source within their rockets, and how they're also contributing back. Right. Yeah, that pull request didn't get merged. That should have. Here's one you might not have known, though. There's actually this set of enthusiasts, the Copenhagen Suborbitals. They're a bunch of enthusiast astronauts. They want to get one of them into space. There's like 50 of them, and they're crowdsourcing this. Which is another big thing that has happened along with open source is the introduction of this true crowdsourcing and Kickstarter campaigns and things like that. A lot of these innovations are all happening in tow with associated Kickstarter, GoFundMe, whatever the case campaigns are. But you read about them and they're like, we're really trying to go. There it is, the world's only amateur space program. So if you guys want to sign up, you might have to live in Copenhagen to actually get in, but it's pretty exciting. And a lot of people, when they looked at SpaceX even, they thought, this is like a joke, but they've really made serious progress. So open source in its nature is a crowdsourced movement, and you're really seeing the power here when people put their minds together and when a lot of those other obstacles go away. There is even an open source space uniform, spacesuit. So there's a bunch of folks that are working together, sharing designs, open source, for creating the next generation spacesuit. The advantage, of course, of it being open source is if multiple of these groups pop up that want to basically put people into space, they can maybe use the exoskin. Now, there's a QA question there, but we won't deal with that. Adam, you want to volunteer for QA on that one? The next thing I'm going to show you is actually a little insane. Can you guys read it? It says, "Mom, can you buy me a satellite as a Christmas gift?" Yes, darling. So imagine an open source enthusiast wanting to build a satellite and put it into space. You might say, why? That's one question. But another question would be, like, how? How could this even be possible? So these are some silly early drafts. Can I go with you? And this guy, his name is Joon Song. He actually built an open source satellite. Not only did he build an open source satellite, which made him able to publish the Satellite for Dummies book, which actually doesn't exist, but he actually did it. He actually got that satellite into space. Open source. All the designs for the satellite were open source. He built it himself. It cost him $600 to build the satellite. You know how much it cost for him to get it into space? Anybody want to guess? How much? More. 100,000. And I saw this guy. I thought he was nuts. Like, I thought it was so cool. He came to OReDev in Sweden before the satellite launched. And OReDev always has awesome keynotes. So they had this guy as one of the keynote speakers, and he was talking about his mission to build an open source satellite. And everybody in the room, their jaws just dropped and thought this guy is just nuts. But you know what? He proved us all wrong. He created this satellite. He got it up into space. Open source, baby. That's pretty cool. Okay, so we've just spent, the last 30 minutes really looking at a lot of the innovation that is happening in open source. We looked at the things that are close to us that are happening, that are changing how we develop code. But then we looked at how open source as a movement, and that is, the second half is what I really want you to think about. That open source really does open the ability to have a big impact on where society goes. So what's next? Where is it? Like, it's already made great progress, but what's the next big thing? Well, one of the next big things is the fact that government is now embracing open source. And who knows where that's going to go. You may not have known this, but there is a github.com/whitehouse. And you probably have heard of some of the stuff that Obama has been pushing with open data and opendata.gov. So there already is, and the really cool thing about that is, like, my friend Kin Lane, who is the API evangelist, go to apievangelist.com, he actually reported to the CTO in the White House. Open source guys that are being brought in because as the White House is moving and as the government is looking at open source, they're coming back to us to tell them what's the proper way to do it. That's pretty crazy, in a good way. I don't know what's next after that. I mean, I think IoT is going to continue to grow. We're going to keep seeing more open source activity around IoT. And I think we're going to continue to see new tools coming up. One of the things I didn't mention was cloud. You have OpenStack. OpenStack is a completely open source cloud solution that you can run on your own environment. Cloud Foundry is another one. I didn't have room for everything in the slides. This innovation is going to continue, but what else after that? What's the next kind of shocking thing, like the satellite, etc.? I don't know, but I do know this. You guys are going to make the decision. You guys have the opportunity to decide what is next. That's it. Thank you guys very, very much. I'll take some questions. I think we have a couple of minutes left. If anybody wants to ask questions or has any comments, that's all good. What was that? What about brown bag? Oh, brown bag conf? Why do you want me to show that? Ah, it's all online? You mean brown bag conf? Yeah. So brown bag conf is an online conference where you, oh, okay, now I see why you're saying it, duh. So Brown Bag Conf is a recently organized project, and the idea of Brown Bag Conf is you want to give like a brown bag on a topic. A brown bag is like giving a talk. You want to give a talk, and what's really cool that they've done is you basically send a pull request to this GitHub repo that says, I want to give a talk on such and such date. So they're using open source in that way. As a matter of fact, I actually am part of a new show. We're calling it In the Mood for HTTP. And the 3 episodes of that you actually find on Brown Bag Conf. As a matter of fact, you can see here, In the Mood for HTTP. So if you like my pontificating and you want to hear more of it, you can hear me and Daryl Miller talking about all things HTTP, any kind of questions you have on APIs, hypermedia, etc. But another important point that I think Brown Bag Conf brings up is that people are using GitHub in lots of interesting ways beyond just code. Brown Bag Conf is one example of that. There's lots of conferences. One of the conferences that when we ran Fringe, actually we didn't do this with Fringe, but other events I've done, you basically, actually we did. Yeah, you can send a pull request with basically a suggestion for a session at that conference. But then we're seeing things like RFCs. So those are like sometimes the most boring things in the world if you have read RFCs. But it turns out to be a pretty painful process going through these standards boards and bodies. They exist, they're not going away. But the tools are very antiquated. So a lot of RFCs have actually now moved to GitHub. So you can fork the RFC, you can make comments right there, and then it's immediately available rather than using a lot of the tooling and things that are out there. And I think GitHub has been, I mean, I didn't mention it on the slide, I probably should have. I mean, none of this, like you look at a lot of these projects that I showed you are all centered around GitHub. So GitHub is amazing. GitHub has been one of the most disruptive services, technologies that is, I don't know if technology is the right word for it, that has shown up and has really enabled open source to move forward. So, you know, you should hug or kiss any of your friends that work at GitHub because they're amazing. And I think you'll continue to see interesting innovations happen where people will try to use GitHub for different kinds of things because it's just really lightweight and easy. And you know, the forking notion actually is valuable for a lot of different reasons. I just learned recently, I didn't realize that gists were actually repos behind the scenes. So you can actually create a gist with multiple files in it, and then you can actually clone that. I mean, it's a free way to just get some simple files up there that you can pull down without having to go through creating all the repo and things like that. I guess one question I have for you is, do you feel optimistic seeing what we saw today? Does that inspire you? Does it make you, does anybody have any inspirations that they felt through the talk or things they think about or where they'd like to see things go? And how do you connect to this as a .NET developer? That's another question. Again, as I said, I meant what I said, that look, this open source is a community, a very large community, and the fact that you're a .NET developer doesn't change the fact that you are an open source developer. But I'm interested to hear what some people feel. We have, if you feel like sharing, we have about 5 more minutes. Yeah?
Sure, just a really quick one. I don't know if this is as a .NET developer or just as a developer, but I keep thinking that there's some way to put together like crowdfunding and the hardware and Internet of Things stuff that's coming out in open source in general to find ways to make cities better, make cities more livable somehow. And I'm not even sure where it goes. Is it traffic systems? Is it transit systems? Is it something around making cities more livable? Is it open government? But something around making use of all of this stuff in order to make cities better.
That's a great idea. That's a really great idea. And I know there have been things like, I know Microsoft, for example, was very involved in a bunch of city-related things in Asia. But pointing out that the community now has that ability and the fact that these devices are now approachable, yeah, that's great. Anybody else? Awesome. Yeah, there's hundreds of thousands of data feeds that are out there now. If you go to like open data, all different kinds of things. And you know, the thing that Obama did, which I give him a lot of credit for, he basically put a mandate that said that all these government organizations have to open up. They've all been silo-based. And as they're opening up, it's not just about those organizations being able to communicate with each other. It's if that data is data that is public data that, you know, there's no real privacy concern that can be defended, that has to be open to you and me, which is pretty exciting stuff. Anybody else?
I think interesting use of open source GitHub. I don't remember where I saw it, but a couple years ago, I don't know if he's still doing it. There was this guy who was doing all of his home repair through GitHub issues. So somebody would come over and say, faucet's leaky or your door handle's loose or whatever, and he would make an issue and he would work on it and he would actually like list the steps of how he renovated parts of his house and people would actually send him suggestions and like, oh, this is the tools you need or this is what you need to follow. Now, I don't know where he went with that, but I thought that was a really cool use of GitHub and pull requests.
Yeah, maybe GitHub can help save marriages. I'm going to tell my wife to send me file issues. There's a good chance I'll actually get to them because of all the different ways that GitHub has a way of finding me. I'll be like, go file the issue. And then if she tells me, like, why wasn't that done? Or vice versa. Yeah. As long as my kid doesn't find it, then I'll be okay. Awesome. Well, you guys have been great. Thank you again. Thanks for coming out to this event. If you have any questions, I'll be around. And have a great rest of your time.